I can see more people coming in. But thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Fraser, Sutherland. I'm the Chief Executive of Humanist Society Scotland. I'm hosting this panel session this evening. We'll have around an hour and a half, and so for the first hour we'll have this panel discussion, and for the final part we'll have some of your questions from the attendees to the panel. In the Zoom function you should see an option for a Q&A if you put your cursor towards the bottom. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. And our team, there's a couple of staff working in the background, just will curate that and we'll try and answer as many things as possible. We do expect a sizable number of people attending, so if we don't get to your question, apologies, but we'll try and cover as much as we can this evening. Okay, so the other thing to say as well is we are recording the session, so that other attendees who aren't able to join us tonight, but other members and supporters of the Humanist Society and other people who are interested in this topic will be able to watch it on, say, our YouTube channel, where we'll upload it afterwards. But just to reassure you, if you're attending as an attendee, we can't see you, we can't hear you, so you're not being recorded. This is just the panelists that are in front of you that are being recorded. So please be reassured in terms of whatever you do your end, we can't see it. So it's only the panelists. Before I introduce the introduction to the topic, I'd like to introduce you to the panel as you can see them. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Emma Wadsworth-Jones from Humanists International and formerly at PEN International. And I've just asked Emma to say a couple of words about her background and why she's interested in the topic for this evening.
Well, I suppose it's because of my freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief background. I think the two blend beautifully when it comes to banned books. Having worked at PEN International, which is an association of writers that promotes freedom of expression and defends writers who are being persecuted, there's often been an overlap with the cases that I work on and have worked on with Humanists International. So I can talk a bit about that over the course of today.
Fantastic, thanks Emma. And next I'm pleased to welcome Professor Maggie Kinloch, Theatre Director, Professor Emerita of the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and current Vice Chair of Humanist Society Scotland and a celebrant of Humanist Society Scotland as well. And so welcome Maggie, and do you want to say anything about your background and why you're interested in this?
Thanks, Fraser. Well, as Fraser said, my background is that I'm a theatre director, so that means that I've spent my working life working with words, interpreting the words of playwrights, writing some stuff myself, and now as a celebrant, of course, I'm writing constantly, ceremonies, wedding ceremonies, naming ceremonies, celebration of life ceremonies. So the word has always fascinated me, and of course the right to express ourselves and our opinions with strength and creativity has always been, well, it's been right at the heart of what I've done. So that's why I'm here tonight.
Thank you, Maggie. And we also have another representative from the world of stage. We have David Greig, playwright and artistic director of the Royal Lyceum Theatre. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Yes, I guess I share the previous comments. I would also add theatre is a place where representation is what happens, and that involves representing things that can be difficult. You often, in order to do plays, you have to have characters who say or do or articulate points of view or expressions that are very difficult, and that is something that increasingly is in question in the modern world, but has been in question throughout the existence of theatre as well. And so it's a topic of great interest to me. But I agree with Emma, freedom of religion and freedom of expression are very much where my background in this would be.
Fantastic, thanks David. And last but not least, we have Terry Anderson, cartoonist and executive director of Cartoonist Rights Network International. And those of you who were at our conference in June will recall Terry giving a really good overview of the risks faced by cartoonists and by artists in general when critiquing governments, critiquing religions, and holding people to account, really. And it was, I think, a fascinating talk. So I'm delighted to welcome Terry back, and I wonder if you want to say anything else, Terry.
You've covered it very well, Fraser. only to say that obviously I'm very happy to join you again. Ours is a human rights organisation first and foremost, and our constituency, as you say, is cartoonists. In the past, that's meant largely press and editorial political cartoonists, but increasingly now it also includes people who have a large social media audience, people that produce long form material, graphic novels, etc., street artists, and more in the way of what I would call activist artists. So inevitably that has and will brought cartoonists into conflict with religion. There's a few very obvious cases. I won't name them now. That's a spoiler alert. We'll get into them later, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for the introductions. And just as a way of introducing the topic tonight for discussion, this week is Banned Books Week, which is why we decided to hold this session. Book banning, as some of the panelists said already, is far from a new phenomenon, and book banning for religious reasons by either a religious authority or the state has been practiced by many religions and societies for hundreds of years. The Vatican first issued their Index of Forbidden Books, for example, in 1559, and it remained actually in use until 1966. Religious censorship is usually enacted on the grounds of blasphemy, heresy, sacrilege, or impiety, with the works in question being banned for being obscene, challenging the dogma, or violating a religious taboo. The other reason that we wanted to hold this event tonight was obviously the recent horrific attack on Salman Rushdie, a high-profile humanist, as many of you will know, and the increase in the book banning that we're seeing in the United States as well, which is often being driven by Christian fundamentalists and vocally supported by far-right politicians, leading me to ask my opening question to the panel tonight. Do we think there's a link between religion gaining political significance, or in countries where there's already a link between religion and politics, like in Iran, for example, and a rise in book banning in some of these countries? Maybe we can start with Emma on this one.
Well, I think, like you said, book banning has existed for centuries and in a wide variety of contexts. It's not exclusive to the US or to Iran. And it can exist both as prior censorship as well as post-censorship. So you might find that some books just can't ever be published, for example, because it won't meet the standards or the threshold. Films might not pass a certification board, for example. Plays might be prevented from being staged, and that might be by the state, or it might be by individual actors even. It can really vary. I think when we look at the US, I think we can say with a relative amount of certainty that yes, the growth in strength and power of the religious lobbyists is having an effect and has had an effect. And I think that comes through, if you have a look at PEN America publish a report on banned books every year, and their report quite clearly outlines that when it comes to the US since 2021, the increase in banning of books isn't at the request of individuals. Most of it comes from about 50 organized advocacy groups, lobbying groups. And when you delve down further into that, you often can look and see that many of them have a religious agenda, a usually Christian conservative agenda, and some of them might even have the stated goal of bringing education more into line with religious values. And so, yes, I think definitely there. When it comes to Iran, it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Religion is a fundamental backbone of how the state operates now since the revolution. So I think there it's slightly different. There have been book bans there for decades. So I'm not sure if there is a rise in instances of banning in Iran necessarily. When it comes to the case of Salman Rushdie, of course, the Ayatollah issued the fatwa, but subsequent governments sort of distanced themselves from it. But that doesn't mean to say they haven't prevented other books from being published.
Conscious Terry, this is an area obviously that a lot of your members will have horrific experience of their censorship, but is it do you often see a link between the politics and religion and where the censorship comes in for cartoonists, or is it a variety of different things?
I mean, obviously, as you say, Fraser, it's quite a varied collection of rapscallions and ne'er-do-wells. But Emma's right, it's definitely where religion and nationalism intersect is really where the problem is. A good example of that maybe would be a cartoonist I was with this week, Zunar from Malaysia, who years ago had some problems with very serious sedition charges. And all of that was essentially put to bed after the 2018 elections and a change of government. But now, as he was describing it, there's a new sedition charge in the offing. It doesn't come from the same level of government as before. It's actually a state governor rather than national government. But it's his home state. It's the area of the country that Zunar hails from. And the cartoon in question was about how, as Zunar saw it, the various religious communities and minorities within the state had lived quite harmoniously, and it was multiculturalism in action until Islamic nationalist governor was elected and made moves to curtail other religious holidays. So Zunar's cartoon portrayed this particular governor bringing a meat cleaver down on these communities. And he's being charged not with blasphemy, but with sedition again. So it comes from a place of religious sensitivity, but it amounts to a political crime.
David, in your opening statement, you said about theatre being an important place to kind of challenge things and things being reinterpreted and re-challenged. I mean, I know you spoke very importantly at the time of the hate crime bill in the Scottish Parliament being passed about the importance of theatre having this ability to, critique and re-critique things. Are you conscious from others in your kind of line of work of this kind of politics and religion being intertwined in terms of censorship?
Yes, I'm very conscious of it, and I have some specific examples where it's already been an issue. However, I would say that religion, you very much focused on religion, and I do think that is an issue, and I'll come back to that specific example, but I don't think it's only religion. I think that something has taken place where, for reasons that are quite understandable, the principles, if you like, of free speech, free discourse have become challengeable, have become less, have sometimes explicitly been challenged as both antithetical to, for example, let's say Christianity or Islam, but also as antithetical to the progressive left in some occasions. And what that's meant is that I am not finding a defense of, if you like, the principle of open civic discourse in anything like as strong a position as it would have been when I began my career in the theatre. And I do, as I say, there's some very good reasons underlying the questioning of some of those Enlightenment assumptions that we were supposed to hold to. But I am deeply concerned about the erosion. So for theatre, from celebrating the loss of the censor, which we had in Britain right up until the 60s, and in Eastern Europe much more recently, we've gone to essentially allowing ourselves to have a deep awareness of censorship from a number of sources. So government, as we talk about with the hate crimes bill and various other things, the Tory government, just as equally as the Scottish government, or governments everywhere, are starting to feel like speech, and particularly speech from the stage, is something that willing to get involved with. And the very dangerous thing being that they do not see the stage as being any kind of space in which, as far as they're concerned, that is simply speech, and there is no nuance about how that functions as speech. So Tomorrow Belongs to Me from the song Cabaret, you know, it's a deeply ironized exposition of fascism that is meant to leave you sickened. But you could equally say it's hate speech because it's, you know, showing fascists expressing themselves. Anyway, I just want to go to a specific example. I had a play, which I may get into more detail about later, but suffice it to say, by a young Asian Scottish woman who wrote a play that represented Hindu gods as working class Dundonian characters. This was I think a very funny, very good play. We did it as an audio piece, but we found ourselves faced with a letter writing and internet campaign very, very fiercely denouncing us for doing this, and denouncing us if the play was ever to go any further. And really, you know, being pretty, I would say, explicit that we might expect not just protesters outside, but, you know, we couldn't be held responsible if windows were broken, or, you know, this kind of feeling. And what I just want to be clear about is that one of the things that made that play almost harder to defend was a world in which the liberal order might say, well, you're offending Hindu people, not seeing that what we're doing is defending a young working class Hindu woman's right to express her own experience of religion in entirely her own way. And many of the people talking to us were essentially middle class, or indeed even wealthy people from even sometimes other countries, kind of crushing in and saying, no, we are Hinduism in the United Kingdom. Well, I found, and this is something that I've seen happen before. So I think there's a really deep issue that if you don't defend free speech as a principle, and if you do it on the, you know, assumption that you're helping perhaps sometimes people who do face oppression, you often end up with the person being silenced not being the middle-aged white man, but being the young working class brown woman.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, David. That's given good cause for thought there. Maggie, if I come to you next, is there anything you want to add? Is there any experience you have from like colleagues in the sector?
Picking up a bit on what David was saying, I wanted just to share a story, a true story. Some years ago at the Tron Theatre in Glasgow, I had directed Jackie Kay's show, The Mob Ruin Monologues, and we were in the main house and we were selling out, and it was, you know, fantastically successful week. But Jo Clifford was upstairs in the Tron with her fabulous Jesus Queen of Heaven. And of course, massive, 300 people in Parney Street every night with handing out Christian leaflets and protesting against this play, Jesus Queen of Heaven. And it was terribly disturbing, although the slightly amusing side of it was that every so often somebody would come in and say, why are the Christians protesting about Mob Ruin? And we had to explain Mob Ruin wasn't what they were protesting about. But it was very intimidating. But also what then happened was, over the course of the week, the Glasgow Evening Times picked up this story about these protests that were happening. And so there was a kind of front page story about it. And that night, a crowd of us sitting in the bar afterwards, and a woman who joined us for a drink, a lesbian woman, as she left the building, was queer bashed, for want of a better term, by four chaps who had read in the Evening Times what was going on. And they were just sitting waiting for her to come out of the building, anyone to come out of the building. It happened to be her. And she was beaten up. Now, that whole context that was happening there, and I should have added that, of course, both plays were part of the Glasgow Festival, so there was a kind of context around that. But it was just a very frightening place to be for everybody. And I actually went and spoke to one of the protesters, and I said, look, you know, you're handing out leaflets asking everybody who comes into the building to pray for the souls of LGBTQ people, and we haven't asked you to pray for our souls. you don't really have the right to ask people to do that for us. We haven't asked you to do it. But I was given quite a lot of verbal abuse for that challenge. So there's a whole thing around the right of Joe to make that show, to perform that show. And I don't know if you've seen it, but if you have, it's very beautifully done. And it's an international success. It's been translated, I don't know, David, you'll know better than I do, but into many languages and performed in many countries. But a Christian group decided that that was not acceptable in Glasgow and placed fear around that whole place.
If we stay on that theme, actually, then one of the things that I had down here to cover around kind of LGBT plus identities, and that there's quite a lot of resurgence and pushback on that in kind of the last 3-4 years, when perhaps some of us had expected that we got to a stage where equal marriage was passed, that restrictions around adoption had been changed in terms of the governance and the law, but yet a lot of the things that we've seen in the past in terms of homophobia and things like that, it's almost come back into the fore in a mainstream way that perhaps the people who were involved in the equal marriage campaign had hoped had in some ways been a wee bit of the past, although there was always going to be an element of it sticking around. Is there an idea of where that comes from? I mean, I'm conscious that obviously some of it is religious, but is there other elements that play into the kind of anti-LGBT kind of move and push back on rights, I suppose, of LGBT people?
Well, if I may say, from a celebrant's point of view, I conduct probably about half the weddings I conduct are same-sex marriages. And if I may say, I don't think that pushback is coming from families. The families and friends who are there at these weddings, from kids through to grandparents, are open-hearted, celebratory people there to support their loved ones who have chosen to marry. So I don't think it doesn't feel to me like it's coming from families and from the kind of, that layer of society. It's coming from somewhere else. And of course, in part, it's the churches. I don't know. Academically, it may well be that there's papers that are coming from the academic sector may well be part of this as well.
Anything from your experience, Emma, in terms of internationally, that you're seeing any links between religious groups or other groups and this kind of pushback on?
Well, I think that what's often used to restrict LGBT content, particularly, is the idea of obscenity, and I think that there are sort of stereotypical ideas that any material that talks about LGBT or has LGBT characters in must intrinsically be obscene. There's links to these ideas of pornography and all kinds of things that I think are fundamentally just flawed and wrong. And just because you mention a same-sex couple does not mean something is obscene. There is much more of a definition to obscenity than that, but it's quite an easy word for people to bring out and then to try and manipulate and use. And I think, unfortunately, there are certain conservative groups that would really latch onto that and support it. I mean, we've seen over the years, I think it was back in 2012, Russia banned any materials in education, particularly that might corrupt the minds of children, which was specifically designed to not allow them to learn anything about LGBT rights or even really sex education. And again, it's about protecting the minds, these young, youthful minds, from anything that could possibly harm them, supposedly.
Can I pick up on that?
Yeah.
And let's be blunt. It's not conservative. It's fascist. The sanctity of the heteronormative family unit is a central tenet of fascism. So the pushback that's happening at the moment is driven largely, I would suggest, by a resurgent fascist tendency, and also a reliance on our collective lack of retention or lack of memory. I'm in the middle of a project at the moment that's concerned with the earliest days of the AIDS pandemic. I was but a wee bairn at the time, you understand. But looking at all that stuff, it's indistinguishable from what, on the one hand, from what's being said now about monkeypox. It's exactly the same thing. The first time a child came down with monkeypox, all sorts of disgusting speculation about how that happened, as if gay people don't encounter children at any point. And on the other hand, you know, as a kind of menace to society, if you like, specifically trans people, the way that's being discussed in some quarters at the moment, again, is indistinguishable from the way that gay people were marginalised and vilified in that period. There's nothing new under the sun. So obviously, again, that ties in with what we're discussing more broadly, because, you know, where you've got a fascist, chances are you've also got somebody that's co-opting a particular religion, again, to further bolster that narrative.
I'm conscious that, you know, as a humanist organisation, we're aware of other humanist groups and the work that they're doing, and in particular in Eastern Europe, there's a rise in, you know, quite far right politics and the pushback agenda. I don't know if David has any connections to anyone in Eastern Europe and has seen more kind of restrictions of work there in terms of literature or theatre at all.
Well, it's definitely happening in Russia, and I mean, it's happening in Russia to Russian theatre directors. They were attacked and silenced before Putin invaded Ukraine, partly because they were plainly the place where opposition to that would be found. But we also mustn't underestimate the power of utterly flattening a city to quiet free speech. I mean, if you literally bomb a theatre, well, that's gonna, which is what they did in Mariupol and have done in other places as well. I guess, you know, in Eastern Europe, the absolute threat of violence to silence the existence, not just of, you know, we're talking about Ukraine as a people, but Ukraine as a culture is what is absolutely at issue here. The very idea that the language or the expression of Ukrainianness is reasonable is being threatened. So we mustn't avoid that. But there is also in Hungary, and to some degree in Poland as well, right-wing censorship. Britain, my experience of the British theatre world currently, although these things can always change, is that right-wing censorship per se is not primarily the main thing we're facing. The main thing we're facing at the moment is a very, very heated, very a world in which the sort of, there's a kind of call out culture available, which I think it leads to a sort of chilling effect across theatre generally, where rather than face, basically nobody wants to defend anybody, I think, and so, you know, it can come from all sorts of different angles, but you're just afraid of, you're constantly afraid that something that somebody says or does on your stage or on your Twitter stream or on your Instagram will in some way result in you being the sort of subject of the day. And that can be, and I have to say, you know, it can come from any angle at the moment. I think the problem that what I'm feeling is, if we do not defend, if we do not have a robust principle of which, you know, it's the old-fashioned thing. I don't like what you're saying, but I defend your right to say it. And unfortunately, we've decided, it feels to me that as a kind of literary or cultural milieu, we've decided that we don't think that's right, that we don't defend your right to say it. That in fact, if we don't like what you're saying, we don't want to hear you should not only not be heard, but we will actually try to make sure that nobody else hears you either. Now, very complicated. I don't, there's lots of things I don't really want to hear and I wouldn't put on my stage. But I do feel anxious that I do feel anxious about it at the moment. I think it's everywhere, and I think you can't defend easily against the religious attacks if you're not also defending against the attacks that come on, for example, sometimes religious people from the other point of view. I think yeah, sorry, we yabbered on. I'm a centrist dad in this.
Could I just jump in on that? Because I think for me, what I suppose it has always troubled me, but in the same way I've become more troubled recently, is that whatever a writer writes and whatever their intention as they write it and whatever they wish to say with it, and they believe that they have crafted the piece well enough for that to be clear, in a sense, as soon as it's published or produced or whatever this piece is, the writer becomes kind of irrelevant now, because it will be interpreted. And of course, it has always been thus, but now one feels that those who are waiting to interpret they hold stronger views and they're more prepared to tackle you, as you've just described, David. So it's this contradiction between the writer's intention and the way in which it is interpreted and the various groups by whom it will be interpreted, and how they conflict with one another and also conflict with the writer's position.
I'm sorry, I don't want to hog this, but as a writer, I once, so I'm a playwright as well as an artistic director, and most of my career has been as a playwright. I've done a lot of work in the Middle East. I've done a lot of work in countries where there was actual censorship. I've also worked with young writers and so on. And when I was working in Palestine, I was working with young playwrights, we discovered a good metaphor because which was about checkpoints. And we discovered that what I was trying to explain is all writers have checkpoints in their head, where as the idea comes forward, the ghost of your mother, or not your ghost, but your mother says, "Oh, you can't say that, don't say that," or your or if you say that, your friend won't like you, or if you say that, people will think you're weak or vulnerable. People will think you're an idiot, and so you don't let the idea pass. And just as Palestinians find the checkpoints are annoying, not because they fundamentally stop you, because they just stop the easy way of the thing getting through. So Palestinians were always finding ways to use back alleys and mad journeys around to get to where they wanted to go. And what I was saying to them is that you as the writer, you're always trying to get past these big checkpoints in your head. And that's always been the way I've understood what writing is, that you're trying to get something that is behind your ego, because that is the only way that you're going to get to some kind of truth. And often it will be a truth that might embarrass you, might humiliate you, it might even cause you to be disliked by people. But that is important. It's important that somebody does that. That's what art is, And I guess my concern is that those checkpoints, far from being less manned nowadays, are there's more and more and more of them. And I see more and more work that it's gone through so many checkpoints. You just go, oh God, why would I go and see this? It's just telling me you're a nice guy. Why do I don't want to see that? Or you're a nice woman, it's not all gendered that way, but sorry, that was my ramble on Maggie's point about writing, which is that, yeah.
Absolutely. When we had a discussion at the time around the hate crime bill and the evidence that we were given to the Justice Committee at the time, and a point that we made as the Humanist Society time and time again, because they had introduced these strange provisions, in my view, around the theatre as a particular place that was to be controlled and restricted, that there was a threat to obviously self-censorship as well, and that's effectively the point that you're making, that artists are almost self-censoring themselves. I mean, I don't know, Terry, in terms of your work in Cartoonists, is that something? I mean, obviously a lot of cartoonists are anonymous, and I assume that's out of fear for reprisal for their work.
Pseudonymous maybe than anonymous is a better description, yeah. Using pen names or other aliases. An interesting discussion again that that I was looking back on lately was about some female cartoonists who just use surnames, and as such the general audience isn't aware necessarily that they're women, and how they often find that on the one hand it spares them a lot of abuse, but also surprises people when they turn up to speak at an event or what have you, and people didn't realise who it was they were engaging. I think that the kind of the metaphor that always comes up whenever we're in conversation is, and it'll be familiar, I'm sure, to those listening, is the old saw about do you punch up or do you punch down? Cartoons, political cartoons, editorial cartoons, broadly speaking, are negative. They're expressing frustration, anger, disgust, disillusionment, dismay, opposition to, skepticism about a particular thing. Cartoons that are nicey. We've seen a lot of those lately in our part of the world. There was a little period there where all the cartoons were really, really nice. I don't know if anyone noticed that. But you know, they tend to be making a contrarian point. The Portuguese cartoonist Andre Carrilho, whose work appears for UK audiences, they'll know him best from the New Statesman. He was asked to kind of wrap up his take on 3 years of Boris Johnson, and there's a quote in his piece that I've claimed for my own. I use it all the time now, where he says caricaturing is militant doubt. It's an expression of militant doubt. So when it comes to those cartoonists who have been accused of blasphemy specifically, whether it's against Islam or whether it's against Christianity or what have you, the friction comes from who is the target here. And those that take offence will always suggest that it's the adherents to the religion that are the victims. The cartoonists often will say religion as a system exerts power. It has power. Therefore, any seat of power can be a target for satire. Where it gets mixed up is where religion is taken for race, where an adherent to a religion also happens to be an ethnic minority that's put upon or not treated with parity in a particular society. And then seen through those prisms, it then becomes, like I was saying before, what is intended often as punching up becomes punching down. And obviously, in our field, Charlie Hebdo casts an incredibly long shadow. Yeah. Thankfully, there's been nothing quite like it since, and touch wood, there won't be. But obviously, it flares up, as we saw with Samuel Paty. I think we'll get into schooling and education a little bit later on, so I don't want to talk too much about him at this juncture. But all I will say is that for somebody said to me lately that they felt that the terrorists had won. That they felt that sufficient cartoonists had now steered clear of that topic to such an extent that, as far as he was concerned, the terrorists had won. My response to that was, yes, but what was their objective really? In my opinion, their objective, the killing of the cartoonists was the mechanism, if you like. It was the medium. The ultimate objective of religious fundamentalists is to make more religious fundamentalists. And the way those attacks would have achieved that would have been by it resulting in laws being passed and French society turning more aggressively towards secularism and removing religion from public spaces, etc., making it easier for more young men disillusioned already and disassociated from society to be recruited. Some may argue that that is exactly what happened. I think it could have been a lot worse, to be honest. I think that the French could have gone up even farther than what ended up happening. There were some terrible and kind of nonsensical scenes with women being asked to disrobe on beaches by armed policemen and things like that. There are obviously instances where things went badly awry, but it's a continuing conversation. It's an evolving one, and the cartoons themselves, Charlie Hebdo itself obviously continues to exist, but it's still effectively compiled from a bunker, essentially, and the Rushdie attack has only sort of put another layer of varnish on that. You know, I don't know when things will return to normal, if you like, necessarily for that particular group.
Okay, we've had some good questions coming in through the Q&A, and just to repeat for those of you who may have joined us after we'd gone over how it works at the beginning, there is at the bottom of your screen, you can see the wee Q&A function, and if you are watching along and want to ask a question of one of the attendees, pop in a question there. I'm just going to take a couple of them in a second, but before I do, I just want to highlight another upcoming event that we've got, just a wee plug for something else. If you're enjoying the discussion tonight, we may enjoy another discussion on Monday the 3rd of October at the same time at 7:30. We're going to be joined by Professor Sir John Curtis, who's going to cover the topic, does religion still matter in politics? As many of you will know, he's a British political scientist, a senior research fellow at NatCen, and he's a professor of politics at Strathclyde University, and he's going to talk to us about whether religion does still matter in politics at all in a Q&A session. You can register for a free place, and you should hopefully see the information about that in the chat. And now we're going to segue in, hopefully seamlessly, into some of these questions from the audience. So I'm going to take a couple at a time, just because there is a few here, so just taking our steps a wee bit. Belinda says about monkeypox and the conversation we had there, assuming lessons may have been learned from HIV, could it have been reported differently to lessen the biases and ill-informed comments? And also from Mariek, not wanting to sound overly optimistic, I often perceive this as one last attempt at pushback before LGBTQ+ issues get properly accepted and integrated into mainstream norms. Hence, the fear is unfortunately a strong motivator for people who feel that they will lose part of their older conservative reality, perceived one as it is. Terry, you were the one that mentioned about obviously the lessons or the kind of connection between HIV and monkeypox. Do you think the way it's been reported, I assume media, Belinda maybe means, would have made any difference? Or
unquestionably, I would say, yeah, almost from the get-go. I think it was the way it was reported essentially suggested that it was a gay plague, you know, and we've heard that kind of language before. The fact of the matter is, and I stress here, I'm not a doctor, but my understanding is that, you know, it's a sufficiently contagious disease that had it got into, rather than a series of men who obviously had sexual encounters with one another, if it got into a big prison, for example, if it got into a boarding school, if it got into anywhere where people were sharing bathroom facilities or anything like that, you know, it would have spread. And now it's at the point where obviously it's just spreading through any kind of intimate association. So it's been spread from, broadly speaking, if you like, people who are simply affectionate with each other, people who provide care to other people are passing it from one to another. That's the way it's moving around now. And you know, in terms of another lesson that you would hope would have been learned by now, the take-up of vaccination wasn't as fast as it should have been, wasn't as rigorous as it should have been, because we're now living in a world where vaccines are doubted and treated with suspicion in a way that wasn't the case not so very long ago.
And just on that second question, Maggie, about the kind of being optimistic about, is this one last pushback? Do you have any thoughts about that? About, is this are we almost there with this, or is there always going to be this lingering pushback on?
Well, I mean, Marika, I hope your optimism is well founded. I really do. And legislation has moved forward. We have equal marriage, we have adoption laws. In lots of ways in civic society, we have put the infrastructure in place for this all to be, one would think, behind us now, that we can all just get on with life. And yet there is still such, books being banned in school libraries in America, and I think the top 10 banned are all on LGBTQ issues. And you kind of go, really? Surely we have come beyond this. But I hope you're right. I hope this maybe is one last push, but I'm not as optimistic as you are. I'm quite concerned. In fact, I found myself saying to somebody the other day that I have a fear, probably not in my lifetime, but probably in the next few decades, we may find equal marriage being abolished in some countries again. When we saw what happened, quite recently in the United States in terms of abortion rights, then what's the next step? That's a thin end of the wedge. So I'm quite concerned, very concerned, really, that we are going backwards in some ways.
Part of the problem is the zero sum thinking. It's actually people that prize your unhappiness and discomfort. They place that at a higher premium than their own peace and well-being. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this is driven by a desire to upset the people on the other side of the fence. Yeah. They'll be so unhappy when these things that they've got will be taken from them. Mm-hmm. It actually just comes from straightforward malice. It's not necessarily fervently held religious belief. I don't think it would be a wonderful study to see how many of these people in other respects are observant. To what extent are they actually practicing the religion that they espouse, or is it just experiencing? Is it just a quick way to engender hegemony? I think it's a kind of it's a cocktail a lot of the time. It's not just simply religion alone.
David, do you want to come in there?
If that's okay, yeah. So I just want to draw a little comparison, because you talked about fascism, Terry, and I think you're actually right in a lot of ways. And I certainly think we see resurgent popular movements that resemble fascism across the world. But let's say that there is this place, Russia, where I would argue that it is pretty much exactly fascism in so many ways as to be indistinguishable from otherwise. Now, what I find really interesting is that on the one hand, you get the right who go, that Mr. Putin, he's great because he doesn't have any of that trans nonsense and he won't have any of that. And he's very, yes, the church is very strong under Putin. Yes. And we know none of this nonsense about, whatever wokeness, etc. Right. And of course, they are correct. They have identified their own fascism. That's the point. Now, but then where I come in a little bit is there are also people on the left who go, well, you see, NATO is very, very imperialist, and very imperialist, and we don't, and because they'll say that the liberal West has, and it absolutely has done terrible things. It's had empires, it's had all kinds of things that are awful, and they will say, therefore, actually, really, is it not kind of we're all the same? And once you do that, and this is what I think Ukrainians, I think there's so much at the front line of a very, very important thing, which is that there are principles for which you stand. And unless you stand for them, then the fascists, because they're the ones, they'll come and get you. It's not sorry, I've not been very articulate. I get very passionate about it, but it's to do with, I worry that we've got to stand on the principle, because if we don't, the thing that will hit us is not everyone being lovely. It's not, oh, we all won't offend each other. That's what's happened. No, it will be wham. We don't, you weren't prepared to fight. You weren't prepared to stand up. You weren't prepared to defend. And so again, I'm probably being a bit over dramatic. I mean, I do work in the theatre, but I really do feel that I see this parallel where the right is using the liberal and indeed Enlightenment, or whatever we want to call it, using Putin literally does it with bots. He sends them out into the Twitter sphere to foment, as much heat as possible. And I'm afraid I feel sometimes, we rise to it as a society, and we end up in culture wars where we should be dealing with housing and heating and, anyway, sorry. I am optimistic for what it's worth about LGBTQ rights. I think that generally young people are really bringing those things forward, but I do think that we have failed to educate young people in the principles of why free speech is not simply something for the privileged. It genuinely is a basic, deep right for every individual human being.
That seems like a nice segue on to Emma to talk a bit about the just some of the things that we mentioned there, but also just in terms of what Maggie was saying about kind of this, the repeal of the abortion or the court given rights in America. Is there fears from other humanist groups in other parts of the world that they might end up seeing similar types of, already won rights rolling back almost?
Well, I think yes. I think that as much as sometimes we might like to deny it, the US does tend to have an influence on others. And if the US can pass or repeal legislation and roll things back to that degree, other nations will feel that they can do so too. And we know that other nations are trying and are looking at how they can particularly curtail sexual health and reproductive rights. Hungary, we can look at Poland. There are plenty of states where that's happening. You can look at the UK even and look at the debates around having buffer zones and whether they should be allowed or not, which I find fascinating. But essentially, yes, is the answer. I think it is causing concern. We are seeing changes where the US leads, others do follow.
It's interesting, a lot of the work that we're involved in terms of campaigning, the active campaigns that the Humanist Society are involved in at the moment, we find very much, despite the fact that there's obviously humanist principles underpinning a lot of these things, but we come across the same opponents or the same funders of opponents in all the different things, despite them being, so abortion rights and then the buffer zones campaign, assisted dying campaign, equal marriage, even staff members of these organisations. It's the same people, it's the same kind of board members, it's the same funders. And like you said at the beginning, Emma, it's often, in our experience for the things that we're involved in anyway, shows other things, but it's often tied to American Christian groups who are often funneling money into Europe. So as you say, with where America leads, it follows. They're even actually kind of involving themselves in the kind of democratic discussion that's happening at the Scottish Parliament, or trying to influence anyway what's happening here in Scotland, which is it's scary, I suppose, to some of the kind of human rights groups in Scotland, because obviously the resources we have are very small in comparison to some of the funding that can be brought in from overseas. I just wanted to move on to a discussion, and Terry kind of raised it about, and I think it was Emma that mentioned about age appropriateness. and that's often cited as reason for banning books, particularly in schools. And I was just going to ask the provocative question: is this ever valid? Is there a valid reason for restricting books? And where would you draw the line? It's a difficult one, so I'm going to start with David, because let the others have a think.
Well, first of all, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the availability of a book, right? So the reason I'm saying I'm not to be a thing, but when I was growing up, if the book was, for example, not allowed in the school library, that would be regarded as a kind of banning, because I would not be able to access it unless my parents were willing to buy it, and not everybody's parents would, so what I would say concerns me a little bit is the existence of the internet. So books, it's not exactly that books are by the by, and we've called this banning books, but most of the young people who are at school are consuming things through TikTok, through the internet, through all different things, most of which I don't even understand. And the reason I say that is I'm very torn between, if you were asking me, would you ban books from a school library? The answer is no, because by the time something's become a book and it's in a library, in general terms, almost unless it's Mein Kampf, and even there, I probably think that school libraries should have that available for people to be able to discuss, but then I'm relatively keen on free speech. But in general terms, I think if a book is in a library, that should be through. What worries me about the age appropriate thing is, we all know that with a click of our internet button, we can see some pretty outre pornography very, very quickly. And I worry that sometimes the argument, which I really agree with, that information should be free and we shouldn't censor, can elide into an argument which is basically quite a techie sort of argument of, so let's not have any regulation on the internet. And it worries me a lot, because at the moment, the only people who seem willing to regulate the internet are the right wing, and they're the people I really don't want to regulate the internet. But at the same time, I am very, very concerned that the unregulated internet is part of the reason for many of our distresses. So anyway, that's a yabba thing. In general terms, books, libraries, schools, no, I wouldn't. I don't really even think age appropriate matters. If you can, I think teachers can manage it. It's been fine. I don't see it as a real issue.
And I'd second that position about school libraries. I think it was only last year, correct me if I'm wrong, that James Gillespie High School in Edinburgh banned To Kill a Mockingbird and Of Mice and Men.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And I kind of go, and they articulated clear reasons for it, and one could listen to those reasons and go, okay, yeah, I kind of understand that. But surely banning's not the answer. Surely contextualizing is the answer. Surely making sure that the young people who will read and study those books understand the context in which they were written and the context in which they are living now, and are equipped with the ability to analyze that and challenge that. Banning's not the answer.
Also, I feel it denies people, I do understand that I was very privileged and to have a very good education and, a background where books were part of my life and so on and so forth. What really upsets me is the idea that that should be removed from people as a kind of, it's like, so in order to protect the imagined feelings of a person who you don't know and have never spoken to, you will, instead of contextualizing, you will simply not let them read the book that might contain a word or ideas or even just historical moments that might be upsetting. And it's so patronizing.
Absolutely.
I also don't believe, truthfully, that in many cases, the communities who are supposedly being protected by these decisions would, I'm unclear what democratic processes arranged the spokespeople of those communities to come to those decisions. But anyway, in general terms, I totally agree about the examples given.
I was about to say that it is an entirely undemocratic process. You do have one group of people imposing what their view of what is right is, without the bearers of this being able to have a choice in the matter and have a say. And I think something that's really important to remember as well is that children don't grow into rights. Children have human rights. So they have the right to freedom of expression, which includes the right to receive information and to impart information. So from that standpoint, no, that there isn't a reason, or age limits aren't really appropriate at any point. I think that, like you say, teachers, parents can help guide what a child might want to access and decide what might be an appropriate level. But again, with most things, it's about providing context, it's about providing guidance. Outright denying people access to things will either A, spark their curiosity and make them look in some interesting places where they may not get the right information, and will mean that they can't answer the questions that they want to answer, that they need answers to. And it just denies them their right to education as much as their right to freedom of expression and to their right to just learn.
If I may, at the moment, there are protests, incredible protests in Iran, where women are taking off their headscarves. And it's absolutely clear that this is an act of enormous bravery on their part, and one which anybody who supports human rights ought to be behind. And I haven't yet seen a kind of backlash, but I'm worried a bit that there'll be a sort of thing of, well, we mustn't be too vocal in support of it, because really a lot of people in France, as you were saying, Terry, those ridiculous scenes of people being sort of forcibly stripped of their veils or headwear, in France, it's like, it is possible for both of those things to be absolute fundamental wrongs. It is not our place or anybody's place to get involved with anybody else's clothing. That is not, whichever way they do it, it is not. And it's somehow, it's like, that's a really key thing to me, is we must not assume that there are people who can speak on behalf of communities and tell us, oh no, we cannot possibly allow such a thing, all of us, because that is almost always just basically the old men of that community, whether it's old white men, or old men from religious communities. Patriarchs the world over love telling everybody what to do and speaking on behalf of people.
It assumes that beliefs are homogenous, and they rarely are in any community, like you mentioned with your Hindu playwright, and the same with a filmmaker, an Indian filmmaker that I've been working with, who's in Canada at the moment, who produced a short film recently, in which she embodies the goddess Kali, and that has been taken by social media and the Twitter sphere and Indian Twitter, and has led to her facing 9 different investigations for insulting religious sentiments, death threats, both from India but also from within Canada. Her film was pulled from by the University of Toronto, Metropolitan University of Toronto, I should say, who also issued an apology and are declining to rescind that apology, having considered it further. They revoked her honorarium, so she doesn't have access to that. She's been left high and dry, having been invited to do something on multiculturalism. I've seen the film, it's absolutely beautiful. It is a beautiful depiction of multiculturalism. And again, it's her interpretation of her culture. Yeah. She is interpreting her goddess Kali, right? And it's quite clear that there are lots of different interpretations of Kali, and currently the Hindutva are trying to promote one specific vision of who Kali is and how she can be depicted. But lots of people across India, let alone anywhere else, are saying, hang on a second though, that's not my goddess. My goddess Kali is this.
This is absolutely what Terry said when you said about it's the conjunction of nationalism and religion. So what was very clear to me with the playwright about whom I'm talking was that the people who were telling us to stop doing this play weren't doing it because they cared that the gods were represented. They wanted to show that, and in fact, they specifically said, they made a comparison. They said, you wouldn't do this if it was an Islamic situation. So we want to show you that we have that same power. And it was very clear to me that what you've called the Hindutva, so that sense of Hindu nationalism that Modi, and that sense of it coming from Indian Twitter, the whole thing began for us with an American Hindu organization that pretty much sits and fires out complaints whenever it sees the word. It's like almost like a bot searching the internet. It was nothing to do with people being offended. And the last thing I want to say about your beautiful, it inevitably is the beautiful things. So the playwright Jaimini Jethwa said to me that she wanted to represent the gods. The gods had come to earth in the form of a pair of Dundee minks, and I didn't know what a mink was, but it means a working class, sort of rapscallion. And she said it was about what spirituality meant to her, and it was, I believe, a deeply beautiful, deeply moving play. I think ultimately, I still want to put it on, but in the context that it was, for various reasons, all of us involved, including her, felt that she didn't want her playwriting career to begin in this kind of event. And so we decided to work on some other stuff just now, but one day that play will come forth, I hope.
When you were saying, was it minks there, David?
M-I-N-K is what she said, but then she's
okay.
from Dundee. She's Frey Dundee, as she would. Yeah. She's Fae the D, as she would have said to me. And
I was just wondering if it was like many of the minks from the Beano comic.
No,
I grew up with the Beano comic.
I don't even know what it means, but it's to do with. This is the other thing: is that Jaimini is as much Dundee working class as she is Hindu, and she's entitled to that identity. Yeah. And it really annoyed me that I was having to listen to fundamentally middle-class people from Surrey who represented, apparently, Hinduism in Britain, telling me that this was not allowed. And there's lots of, I do know there are intersecting issues, but I found that very galling.
Yeah.
Okay, got another couple of good questions from the audience. Before I do that, I'm just going to plug something else for the audience that are here. The Humanist Society Scotland do have an online book group. They meet every so often, every quarter, I think it is. And on Thursday, 27th of October, we're having a discussion about A.C. Grayling, who's a humanist philosopher, book The Meaning of Things, and you can register for that online at our website, humanism.scot. And I'm going to take the next question, which is from Helen, and she asks, I'm going to see Book of Mormon tomorrow at the Playhouse in Edinburgh. Why is there so little controversy with this musical play? How can it have become so mainstream in comparison to other works of art that have been, I suppose, critical of religion? And just to add, at least 3 of the staff team have already been and seen it, so it's obviously a popular thing with humanists. Maggie, do you want to
Not really. Only to say that it's become one of those shows, I think, like an odd comparison, but like the Rocky Horror Show did. It's become a kind of cult thing. That have you seen it? Have you seen the Book of Mormon? You've kind of got to see it. So it's taken on this whole kind of life of its own. And I remember seeing, I don't know if it was the first production, but a very early production. And I certainly remember that the audience reaction then is quite different to the audience reaction now. Interestingly, there was a lot more offence and distress around the original production or the early productions. So that's interesting.
I think there's a couple of issues. I mean, I saw it in its opening night in London, and it's very, very funny. I liked it, but I think there's a couple of things. Weirdly, I think the authors, it's not that they liaised with the Mormons, but they certainly, I read an article in which Mormons, for whatever reason, have decided that they're not bothered, and if anything, all publicity is good publicity. So, to some extent, they haven't organised a campaign.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, here in Britain, Mormonism is not a political entity that in any way, wishes to engage with the mainstream. So it hasn't. I just think you can. I think Britain's a different culture, in that regard. It's very funny though. It's very good. It is a good show. I mean, weirdly, I've got other complaints about that show, but it's nothing to do with free speech. It's just things I didn't like. But it's very, very funny.
It's interesting. One of the staff team who went and saw it earlier on in the week said actually the Mormons were outside handing out pamphlets and talking to people as they came out of the theatre.
There you go. But surely that is the example we need to follow, isn't that? I mean, good, fair play to them, because that it's perfectly reasonable to, if you're not intimidating, if you're not doing what they were doing with Joe Clifford, stand outside, hand a leaflet,
In a way of, and like you say, not protesting, but actually in a way of like, come along and see for yourself, the local temples, I think, in that case. Shall we take another question from online? David Greenleys asks an interesting question. And I've got my own opinion, but let's see what the panel think. Do you think an independent Scotland would be more or less influenced by American Christian funding and developing of extremist groups? Terry, do you want to tackle this one?
Well, thanks so much for throwing to me on that one. Listen, never say never. I'm done making predictions and prognostications. I've been consistently wrong for the past decade. Pretty much about how every vote, referendum, election, sequence of events was going to play out. So I'm done with all of that. I will never again say it can't happen here or it won't happen here. Should that day ever dawn, then it's just up to us to be vigilant and to try to ensure that that's not what happens. But I'm not convinced there's necessarily an absolute bulwark against it. We've seen other places in Europe very recently slide alarmingly rightward. It rarely comes out of a clear blue sky, obviously. It's normally after some significant gains have been made accumulatively, but who can say, Can I answer David's other question about the Dutch TV sketch? I haven't seen it.
Yes, go ahead. Let me read the questions, because the other members of the audience, I don't think they see the questions. So I'll just read it before you say. So David also asked, how would you defend the Dutch TV show that satirised the Queen's funeral? He goes on to explain, they showed a clip of the hearse driving to Edinburgh, then inserted mocked up shots of inside the coffin and showing the Queen's body.
So I was with a Dutch cartoonist today who described this very thing to me. So I'd say I haven't seen it, but it was described to me. As described, I would say that it's actually very well observed satire. I think that in terms of the institution, Queen Elizabeth's reign was one where the royal family went from being remote and distant figures of myth almost to celebrities. They are now, debatably the dramatis personae of the most successful soap opera on television, i.e. The Crown. So the camera being inserted in that way, even in her last journey, as far as I'm concerned, is valid satirical comment about what happened to the royal family during her reign. More broadly, if satirists and humorists can't make fun of heads of state, everyone I know is out of a job. That's pretty basic stuff. As far as we're concerned, and especially if it's another country. That's just fair game. You get to stand as an outside observer of another country and watch them go through a hugely expensive pageantry of nonsense and say, what exactly is all that about? That's perfectly fair. That's perfectly legitimate. In the same way that we've looked askance at certain presidential elections in other countries, how we laugh every time the Italian parliament falls apart, how we talk about various other spots on the map. So yeah, it's fair game.
I think it also comes back to the question of sort of limitations on freedom of expression, of course, which there are legitimate limitations. It is a fundamental right, but it's not an absolute right. And the limitations of it are primarily that it shouldn't be hateful or incitement to violence. Now, how you define those, how you understand them, can sometimes be deemed to be complicated. I think it's actually, there is quite a clear test for it in international law. If you look at the Rabat Plan of Action, for example, that does exist and there is a framework for it. But most speech doesn't hit that threshold. When it comes to something like what's seen to be defamatory, for example, defamation, governments love using defamation as a tool to censor people. They just love it. Criminal defamation is the best, of course, because then someone has to go into prison and that'll shut them up and shut up anyone else as well. International law is also pretty clear about that. Governments, state officials, religions, bodies with power are not free from criticism, actually, and that they have to accept a higher level of criticism before it can even hit that threshold of defamation. Individuals who are members of the public, that might be slightly different, but when it comes to officials in government, then they don't have quite the same rights because they should be subject to criticism and scrutiny.
I would also say that there's an interesting thing about the law when you talk about defamation. So recently in America, the Jones, the InfoWars guy, was taken to court because he had been claiming, obviously falsely, that the parents of children shot in schools were crisis actors, and they accused him of defamation, and I think they've won that case. But the point was, under the hard light of sort of court, just simple, basic legal discussion, everything about his lies fell apart. And there's something for me about, we've got to be careful because we've got these good, we've in general got, as you say, good legal definitions of these things. Most things, so in some ways, sometimes the law is a good way actually of coping with some of the problems with speech that we have. So Donald Trump and his big lie, the way in which the internet has allowed lies to spread around the world, such as QAnon and these conspiracies and so on. Actually, the law is not a bad place for those things to be sorted out, because the law just has no time for emotional, the clickiness and the dopamine hits of the internet. But the law can only do that if the law is absolutely rigorously, neutral and principled. I think where I get anxious, and you talked about the independent Scotland, in general, I don't see why the independent Scotland would be free of this any more than anywhere else would be. I mean, it's something I would like to happen, but I'd certainly not because I think it will necessarily make things easier that way. But I do think we've got to be very, very careful with these deep principles of the law that it's taken time to get established around the world, and particularly in the democracies, that if it's going to defend us, then it will be because we have defended it against encroachment from the idea that speech is that we have rights to not be upset by things.
Fantastic. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, and there's still loads of questions in the queue and loads of good questions, but I'm afraid we won't have any more time to get to them, I'm afraid. But before we do kind of wrap up for this evening, I do just want to ask each of the panelists, since the theme of tonight, or the thing that brought us together, was around banned books, if they could tell us what their favourite banned book is and why. And also, attendees that are attending, you can type in your favourite banned book and why into the Q&A. We're going to collate these afterwards and create some kind of record of that. So if you want to tell us as an attendee what your favourite banned book is, please do so in the Q&A section. And I'll go to Terry first for your favourite banned book and why.
The obvious cliched answer is Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the graphic novel that often gets removed, even though the whole bloody point of the thing was to make the unpalatable palatable and present the Holocaust in a way that could break through to an audience that otherwise perhaps wouldn't hear first person testimonies. Or in his case, obviously it's his late parents' recollections of what happened. But I'm going to pick a different graphic novel, actually. Not as familiar probably to most people. It's called Bone, as in a bone, Bone, B-O-N-E, by Jeff Smith, which is a fantastic, very long, like Lord of the Rings long fantasy. But it often gets banned. The author himself, Jeff Smith, really doesn't understand why. It's a children's book as far as he's concerned. But it often gets removed from libraries in the way that we're describing. I think simply because even though it's black and white originally, so it's not, there's violence in it, but you couldn't call it gory because it's black and white. But it also has like the odd person having a smoke, has the odd person having a drink. And I think over the years, helicopter parents, if you like, have become increasingly sensitive to these things. And if you know, forgetting that if you see a cartoon character drinking, that doesn't necessarily mean that your child is immediately going to go to the cabinet and pull out the first whiskey bottle they find.
Maggie, we'll come to you next for your favourite banned book.
Well, I think the thing for me is that, as I think we all know, books, plays, poetry can change lives. We can read something that suddenly speaks to us, or we can see something that suddenly speaks to us in a way that nothing else ever did. So with that background, it's an obvious choice for me, but it's Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, banned in 1928. But when I read that book, probably, I don't know, I think it was probably in the early 70s, my life became possible. It changed my life. So there you go. That's my favorite one for that reason. It's not because it's a particularly well-written book. It's not really. But it was there, and I could read it and I could recognize myself and the people like me.
Very strong one, Maggie. There's no pressure on David next to come up with something that is impactful.
Well, okay, I'm probably going to end up being trivial then. I mean, I hadn't given it enough thought to come up with a good answer, and I'm sure there are ones that I'll regret on the way home and go, oh, I should have said that. That would have made me look, you know, thoughtful and wise. But in fact, I'm going to choose two. One is a personal example, which is my own play, Damascus, which toured in Syria. And it was really about young people in that country, and this is obviously before the civil war there, and their desire to get out. And I had written this play actually for a Western audience, but it had ended up touring in Syria. And there was a moment where it went on the stage. It got an awful lot of, we got into quite a lot of trouble. And a lot of people were sort of shouting at me from the audience. But then later I got this queue of young people saying, no, you got this exactly right. Anyway, the long, the short, and the tall was, there was a bit where there was a story of a gun and how the gun got into the hands of a young man who uses it then to kill himself. And that had been censored by the Syrian censor, had refused to allow us to say that speech. And so we'd had to cut it. But then I was invited by the Syrian ambassador in London. And again, all of this is before the Civil War. This is when Syria was a little bit more open than now. The Syrian ambassador in London invited me to a reception around this play, Damascus. And he said, David, this is great. So we have this audience here for Syrian people in London. I'm going to read a bit from David's play that I particularly like. And he then read out the exact speech that they'd censored, and I still to this day don't know if he was playing a political game or if the censor was playing a political game or if none of it mattered. And of course, what then subsequently happened with the Civil War was exactly the upwelling that in a sense that I had only got, not through my insight, but through the young playwrights I'd been working with. Anyways, that was one. And the silly one is 6 Months in a Leaky Boat, which was a song by Split Enz. So I chose a song, and I don't know if you remember, in the 1980s, in the Falkland War, the BBC banned this very jolly song by a New Zealand group called 6 Months in a Leaky Boat. And it was banned because it was thought it would bring bad morale to the task force as they sailed south. And that's always struck me as just one of the exact reasons why you should people just censoring things is stupid. It's just stupid. It's just ridiculous. It's also a good tune. If you don't know it, Google it and you'll enjoy it. It's a good tune.
Thanks very much, David. And then finally to you, Emma, your favourite banned book.
Oh, I mean, it's hard. There's so many to choose from. And I think a good indicator of whether a book is going to be good and interesting and perhaps challenging is if it's been banned somewhere. Most of them have. So I'm quite looking forward to seeing the full list with the suggestions from everybody else too. Oh God, I mean, I've got so many cases whose books I've read and loved, but I think it would have to be something, I don't know, something silly like Roald Dahl's The Witches or Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, like that. It's just an amazing, beautiful book, but it's been banned.
Thanks very much. And I think that brings us pretty much to a close. I'm just going to do one more plug for another event that we've got coming up, which is we've got an event, a film screening for the Climate Fringe Festival. It's a documentary called This Changes Everything, and there will be an online film screening, but there'll also be a curated Q&A for the audience afterwards as well, and that's on Thursday the 29th of September at 7 p.m. online. And again, the details are on our website at humanism.scot/events. And again, it's free to attend, free film screening. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to our panellists, Maggie, David, Terry and Emma, and thanks to all of the audience who joined us this evening. It was great to have so many people come along and have asked some really insightful questions, and I'm really sorry we didn't get through as many of the questions because there's some fantastic ones there that we never got to, but that's just the way these things were limited by time. Also, we've got some good ideas from you, from the panellists, but also from the audience in the Q&A for our first inaugural Humanist Index of Forbidden Books that we'll be putting together in light of this event. Now, on a more serious note as well, if you've enjoyed this evening and want to take one more action for free speech this evening, please do think about donating whatever you can afford to the legal fund for our friend and colleague Mubarak Bala. Mubarak was president of the Nigerian Humanist Association and was jailed in April of this year for 24 years for blasphemous statements relating to Facebook posts he made about freedom of religion. And through her role at Humanist International, Emma has been instrumental in raising the global defence for Mubarak, and even a few pounds towards Mubarak's legal fund will go a long, long way to redressing and the unjust sentence that Mubarak and his family faces. And of course, just a couple of years ago, Humanist Society Scotland decided to make Mubarak our Humanist of the Year after he was initially detained. I don't know if Emma wants to say anything more at this point on Mubarak at all.
No, I mean, what I can say is that the appeal is ongoing, and the lawyers are currently working on filing some additional documents, a more detailed brief that's expected in a couple of weeks. And when it comes to donations, they are gratefully received. We are running quite low on our funds at this point, and everything that we receive will go towards his legal fees, his upkeep in prison, and of course campaign to see him released, which we will continue until he is.
Fantastic. And so the link was sent out with the joining details for this webinar, and when we follow up with a follow-up email, it'll be in there. And also when this webinar ends, I believe if your computer system does it, it will probably take you directly to the Just Giving page as well. Also, if you live in Scotland, please do consider signing up to the Humanist Society newsletter or becoming a member of the Society in order to support our work in promoting humanist values and putting on events like this. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you again for joining us, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Fraser. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.